Before we begin this story, take a moment to share where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Somewhere tonight, someone may be listening with a full heart, and somewhere else, another person may be holding back tears they have never shown anyone. Perhaps this story will find them too. There was once a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, and at 85 years old, she had the kind of face that told a lifetime before she ever opened her mouth. The fine lines around her eyes did not come from laughter alone. The slight bend in her shoulders was not only age. Her hands, though clean and careful, were rough with the memory of labor. Even in silence, she looked like someone who had carried far more than one life should have allowed. But Eleanor had not always been old. There had been a time when she was a bright young woman with chestnut hair, quick steps, and a laugh that used to rise so suddenly that even strangers smiled when they heard it. She was born in a grim industrial town in northern England, where winter seemed to linger too long and opportunity often belonged to families with names people already knew. Her father worked in a textile mill until his lungs gave out. Her mother took in mending from neighbors and stitched until her eyesight blurred at night. Eleanor grew up in a house where nothing was wasted. Tea leaves were used twice. Bread too stale for supper became bread pudding the next morning. Even grief was something you folded neatly and tucked away because there was always work waiting. At 21, she married Thomas Whitmore, a mechanic with kind eyes and grease permanently trapped in the lines of his fingers. He was not a rich man, nor a polished one, but he loved her with a steadiness that made life seem less frightening. They rented a narrow brick home with peeling paint and one coal fireplace that never seemed to warm the whole house. Still, in those early years, Eleanor thought herself fortunate. Then Daniel was born. When the nurse first placed the child into her arms, Eleanor had cried so hard that Thomas laughed softly and kissed her forehead. "He's all right, Ellie," Thomas whispered. "You'd think they'd handed you the moon." "They have," she said, looking at the baby's tiny face. "They have." From the beginning, Daniel seemed different, quiet where other children screamed, watchful where others ran wild. He stared at things as if trying to understand how the world had been put together. When he was 5, he took apart Thomas's alarm clock and somehow put it back together with only one screw left over. Thomas had held up the ticking clock and chuckled. "Either the boy's a genius or we've just been robbed by a very small engineer." Eleanor smiled, but in her heart something deeper stirred. Hope. Dangerous, beautiful hope. Then, when Daniel was only 7 years old, Thomas died. It happened quickly, the way cruel things often did. A lorry skidded on wet pavement one November evening and crushed the front of the garage where Thomas was working late. By the time Eleanor arrived at the hospital, his body was still warm, but he was already gone. The weeks that followed were a blur of casseroles from neighbors, unpaid bills, and the silence of a child who kept asking, "When is Dad coming home?" Eleanor answered that question so many times she began to feel she was dying alongside her husband. But grief did not stop rent. It did not buy shoes. It did not fill cupboards. So she buried Thomas, wiped her face, and went looking for work. She found it anywhere she could. In the mornings, she cleaned office floors before the clerks arrived. By afternoon, she sewed hems and patched uniforms for extra coins. 3 nights a week, she worked in the laundry department of the local hospital, standing for hours in thick steam until her back throbbed and her skin smelled of bleach and starch. On weekends, she scrubbed stairwells in apartment buildings where wealthy tenants passed her without meeting her eyes. Daniel watched her age faster than other mothers. "Mum," he once said when he was 11, standing in the kitchen doorway while she rubbed liniment into her swollen wrists, "are we poor?" Eleanor looked up, startled by the bluntness of the question. "We don't have much," she answered carefully. "Then that means yes." He was too clever to comfort with vague words. She gave him a tired smile. "It means we work harder than some people. That's all." He frowned. "That's not fair." "No," Eleanor said softly. "It isn't. But fairness is not always what we get. Sometimes what we get is a choice. We can grow bitter, or we can keep going." Daniel said nothing after that, But from then on, he studied with a kind of fierce discipline that frightened her a little. By secondary school, his teachers began calling Eleanor in for meetings. Usually, parents feared such summonses. Eleanor feared them too, at first, but every time it was the same. "Mrs. Whitmore, your son is exceptional. Mrs. Whitmore, he has an extraordinary mind. Mrs. Whitmore, if he is given the right opportunities, he could go very far." Those words became both her comfort and her torment, because opportunity was a lovely word when spoken in a teacher's office, but it became brutal when translated into fees, train fare, textbooks, uniforms, examination costs, and the invisible social price of entering places built for children who had never known hunger. When Daniel won a scholarship to a better school in the city, Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table after he had gone to bed and cried into her apron, not from sadness, but from panic. The scholarship covered tuition, yes, but not everything else. There was always another cost, another form, another coat he needed to avoid standing out among the sons of solicitors and consultants. Still, she managed. She took more work, she sold Thomas's tools one by one, telling herself he would understand. She pawned her wedding necklace and later lied to Daniel, saying she had misplaced it during spring cleaning. She began skipping supper, pretending she had already eaten while working late. If Daniel noticed how thin she was becoming, he said nothing. Perhaps he thought not speaking of hardship made it smaller. Then came the letter that changed everything. Daniel was accepted into a prestigious medical program in London. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before she fully understood it. Her son, her boy from the soot-dark town, the child who used to mend broken pens with bits of wire, had earned a place in one of the finest institutions in the country. When Daniel came home and found her still holding the envelope, he snatched it from her hands, read the first lines, and looked up in disbelief. "Mom, I got in." "You did," she whispered. He stared at the page, his voice unsteady. "I actually got in." She laughed through tears. "Yes, my darling, you did." He pulled her into an embrace so sudden and strong that the letter crumpled between them. For one sacred moment, she allowed herself to feel only pride. Then reality arrived. The financial aid package was incomplete. There had been an expected grant that suddenly fell through because of changes in funding and a clerical delay no one seemed eager to correct. There were appeals to file, offices to call, and deadlines that came like knives. Daniel could defer for a year, they said, or he could find the remaining money himself. A year might as well have been forever. "Maybe I should give it up," Daniel said one evening, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Maybe medical school was never realistic. Eleanor, who had just returned from cleaning a solicitor's office and still wore rubber gloves tucked into her coat pocket, turned toward him with such force that even he stepped back. "Do not say that again." He blinked. "Mum." "No, listen to me." Her voice trembled, but not with weakness. "You have fought too hard to stand at this door, only to walk away because money thinks it has more right to your future than you do." Daniel looked down. "I don't know how we're supposed to pay for it." Eleanor crossed the room and cupped his face in both hands, the way she had when he was a little boy burning with fever. "Leave that to me." He gave a hollow laugh. "How? You already work yourself half to death." "I said leave that to me." He searched her face, perhaps hearing something in her tone that unsettled him. "Mum, don't do anything foolish." Eleanor smiled then, but it was the smile of a mother already stepping into the fire before her child could feel the heat. "Foolish?" she said gently. "No. For you, Daniel, I will do only what is necessary." That night, long after he had gone to sleep, Eleanor sat by the window with the financial aid papers spread before her like a sentence already written. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, the house was so quiet that she could hear the old clock in the hallway breathing through the seconds. She stared at the numbers until they blurred, then at her own reflection in the black pane. A widow. A cleaner, a seamstress, a woman with no inheritance, no savings, no powerful friends. Only one son, one brilliant son, one chance. And slowly, as the night deepened around her, Eleanor began to understand with terrible clarity that love sometimes did not ask what was moral, or safe, or fair. Sometimes it asked only one question: how much are you willing to lose so the person you love may rise? Before we continue this story, tell us where you are listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Somewhere, perhaps, in a quiet room after a long day, someone may understand this kind of heartbreak more deeply than they wish to admit. The rain had not stopped by the time Eleanor Whitmore rose from her chair near the window. The house was dark except for the yellow light above the kitchen sink, and the silence around her seemed almost holy, as if the world itself were waiting to see what an ordinary mother would do when love cornered her against desperation. On the table before her still lay Daniel's acceptance letter to medical school in London, the creases from his hands and hers now pressed into the paper like proof of equal hope and unequal burden. Beside it were the aid documents, the list of tuition gaps, accommodation estimates, travel expenses, medical books, and fees so precise and so unforgiving that they felt less like numbers and more like insults. Eleanor had gone over them so many times she could see each figure even when she closed her eyes. She was 58 then, though hardship had already aged her beyond that. Her body was no longer the body of the laughing girl Thomas Whitmore had once spun around their tiny kitchen. Years of bending, scrubbing, lifting laundry sacks and standing on damp floors had made her joints slow in the mornings. Some nights she could feel her heart pounding hard in her chest after climbing the narrow stairs to her bedroom, but she said nothing. Pain, after all, had long since become an ordinary tenant in her life. At dawn, she went to work as usual. That was how Eleanor lived every catastrophe. Quietly. No dramatic declarations, no collapse, only movement. She pulled on her coat, tied a scarf around her neck, and walked through the wet gray streets toward the office building she cleaned before business hours. The city was barely awake, delivery vans rolling through puddles, newspapers tossed onto stoops, milk crates clattering in alleyways. By 7:30 she had emptied bins, wiped fingerprints from brass handles, mopped 3 floors, and smiled politely to men whose shoes cost more than her monthly rent. But all morning her mind returned to the same terrible fact. Daniel had finally reached the gate of the life he deserved, and they still did not have enough money to let him pass through it. That afternoon, she took the bus to the financial aid office in the city where Daniel's scholarship paperwork had been processed. She had already written letters. She had already phoned twice, each call ending with someone passing responsibility to someone else. This time, she wanted a face, a name, a human being who might be harder to ignore if she stood before them in person. The waiting area smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Students in good coats moved in and out with folders under their arms, accompanied by parents who looked annoyed rather than frightened. Eleanor sat in a plastic chair with her handbag clenched tightly in her lap, and waited 48 minutes before being called to a desk by a young administrator whose smile looked trained rather than kind. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore?" the woman said, scanning the file. "I'm afraid the supplemental support fund was reduced this year. But his academic advisor said the provisional grant would likely be confirmed." "Yes, likely," the woman replied, not looking up. "Not guaranteed." Eleanor swallowed. "My son earned his place. He worked for years. He has exceptional marks." "I'm not disputing that." "Then there must be something else, some appeal, some emergency provision." The woman finally looked at her, and for one brief moment Eleanor thought she saw pity. But pity, she would learn again and again in life, was not the same as help. There is an appeals process, the administrator said, but even if the appeal succeeds, it may not be processed before enrollment. The university cannot reserve accommodation or materials indefinitely. How long would it take? Several months in some cases. Several months? Eleanor repeated, almost laughing at the cruelty of it. Then what is the point? The woman's mouth tightened. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. The apology floated between them like something dead and useless. By the time Eleanor returned home that evening, Daniel was already sitting at the kitchen table with his books open in front of him, though he had not turned a page in some time. He looked up the moment she entered. Well? Eleanor removed her coat slowly, buying herself seconds. It is delayed. His face fell, but he nodded as if he had expected it. I thought so. There may still be an appeal. Months from now. Yes. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he gave a dry little laugh that broke her heart more than any shout could have. I suppose that's that, then. No, Eleanor said at once. He looked at her. Mum. No, she repeated, firmer this time. That is not that. He closed the book in front of him. You can't keep pretending determination is money. And you cannot start speaking like a defeated man before life has even begun. His jaw tightened. I'm being realistic. You are being afraid. He stood then, taller than his father had been, thinner too, all awkward limbs and restless intelligence. Of course I'm afraid. Do you think I don't understand what this costs? Every extra shift you take? Every meal you skip when you think I'm not looking? Every winter coat you don't replace? I see it, Mum. Eleanor's chest tightened. She had worked so hard to hide the ugliest edges of their poverty from him, but clever children always noticed more than their parents wished. Then if you see it, she said quietly, you must also see that none of it was done so you could stop now. Daniel looked away. I don't want to bury you for the sake of my ambition. Eleanor crossed the room and touched his sleeve. This is not ambition. This is your calling. He said nothing. That night, after he had gone upstairs, Eleanor took from the cupboard an old biscuit tin where she kept what remained of her private world. Her marriage certificate, Thomas's wristwatch, 2 photographs worn white at the folds, and the pawnshop slip for the necklace she had once sworn never to sell. Underneath these lay an envelope of crumpled notes and coins, money she had been saving for no particular future, because poor people were always told emergencies would come, and she had learned long ago that they were right. She counted it twice. It was nowhere near enough. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor did everything still available to an honest woman. She asked for more hours at the hospital laundry. She took in extra sewing from 3 neighboring streets. She visited the bank to inquire about a loan and was declined before the manager had fully finished pretending to consider it. She wrote to a charitable trust for widows supporting gifted children and received a letter back expressing admiration, regret, and no funds. She even went to see her sister-in-law, Mavis, a woman who had never forgiven Eleanor for being Thomas's great love. Mavis opened the door with eyebrows already raised. Well, this is unexpected. Eleanor stood on the doorstep, gripping her gloves. I won't stay long. That would be best. I came about Daniel. Mavis gave a thin smile. You usually do. Inside, the sitting room was neat in the way homes often are when affection does not live in them. Eleanor explained the situation plainly. The school, the missing funds, the opportunity. She did not beg at first. She tried dignity. But dignity had very little power when speaking to those who had decided long before that your suffering was merely the natural consequence of your station. When she finally finished, Mavis crossed one ankle over the other and said, Perhaps this is life's way of telling the boy not to get above himself. For a moment, Eleanor thought she had misheard. Excuse me? Mavis shrugged. You people always think education changes blood. It doesn't. He might be clever, but cleverness is not breeding. These places have a way of reminding you where you belong. Eleanor's face went white. He belongs wherever his work can take him, she said. Mavis smiled without warmth. No, Eleanor, he belongs to the life he comes from. The sooner he learns that, the less painful it will be. Eleanor stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. Keep your money. I wasn't offering any. No, Eleanor said, voice trembling. I can see that. When she stepped back into the street, she realized her hands were shaking, not from age, not from cold, but from fury. She walked 3 blocks before the anger dissolved into exhaustion so heavy she had to stop and lean against a wall. For the first time since Daniel's letter had arrived, despair truly entered her. What if Mavis was right? Not about Daniel's worth, never that, but about the power of the world to shut its gates no matter how bright a boy might be. What if this was the point where dreams stopped being noble and began becoming cruel? A few evenings later, while working late in the hospital laundry, Eleanor found herself beside a woman named June Hargreaves, who had worked there on and off for years. June was the kind of woman who always seemed to know more than she said. She smoked behind the service entrance during breaks, wore lipstick even on night shifts, and had eyes that measured other people's pain with unsettling speed. "You look dreadful," June said bluntly as they fed sheets through the press. "Thank you. I mean it kindly. I know." June watched her a moment. "Boy trouble? My son. That's usually worse." Eleanor gave a tired little laugh. Something about June's manner, rough, practical, not sentimental, made honesty feel possible. So she told her, not every detail, but enough. The acceptance, the money, the failing options. June listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, the woman glanced around to make sure no supervisor was near. "There are ways," June said. Eleanor frowned. "Ways?" June lowered her voice. "Private arrangements. People with money looking for donors. Sometimes relatives, sometimes not. It's not the sort of thing spoken about in canteens, if you follow me." Eleanor stared at her. The press machine hissed between them. "I don't," she said, though she did. June wiped her hands on a towel. "A woman I knew did it years ago, called it a medical donation, came out with enough to clear her debts. It's dangerous, yes, everything is, but poor people have bodies too, and sometimes that's the only asset anyone values." Eleanor went cold all over. "You're speaking of selling an organ." June did not answer at once. "I'm speaking of surviving." For the rest of the shift, Eleanor could not think straight. The words moved through her like poison, and yet beneath the horror was something even worse: recognition. Because she understood at once why such things happened. The respectable world called it unthinkable, but the respectable world had never sat at a kitchen table calculating how many years of genius could be lost for lack of one final payment. When she returned home, Daniel had fallen asleep over his notes. His cheek rested against a textbook, one hand still curled around a pen. Eleanor stood there for a long time looking at him, at the dark lashes she used to brush from his brow when he was small, at the sharp, intelligent face that still, in sleep, held traces of the child who had once believed she could fix everything. She covered him with a blanket and turned off the lamp. Then she went into her room and sat alone on the edge of the bed in the dark, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles ached. She told herself no decent mother would consider such a thing. She told herself she was only tired, only frightened, only listening too closely to desperate people. She told herself she would wake in the morning and think more clearly. But deep inside, where truth lived without polish, she already knew something had changed. The world had shown her every respectable door, and one by one each had closed. And now, in the black silence of that small room, Eleanor Whitmore began to look toward the one remaining choice that decent people would condemn from a safe distance, but that a mother in love might still call necessary. Before we go on, tell us where you are listening from and what hour of the day or night it is in your corner of the world. Some stories are heard in the stillness of midnight, and some arrive in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, only to leave the heart heavier than before. Eleanor Whitmore did not sleep at all that night. She remained seated on the edge of her narrow bed long after the house had settled into silence, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that the fingers grew stiff. The idea June Hargreaves had placed before her in the laundry room had not faded with time. If anything, it had sharpened. It had become clearer, more distinct, as terrible thoughts often do once they have found a place to live in the mind. At first, Eleanor tried to reject it on moral instinct alone. No decent woman would do such a thing. No loving mother would turn her own body into a marketplace. No future could be worth that kind of risk. Yet every argument against it led her back to Daniel's face, his eyes when he read the acceptance letter, the way his voice had shaken when he said he had actually gotten in, the quiet humiliation in him each time money rose up like a wall between his talent and the life he had earned. And worse than that was the knowledge that if he lost this chance, he would blame the world in public, but blame himself in private. By dawn, Eleanor had not reached peace, she had only reached clarity. The poor were often told that their dignity was priceless. It was a comforting lie spoken by people who had never had to choose between dignity and survival. In Eleanor's life, everything had a price. Sleep had a price. Hunger had a price. Widowhood had a price. Hope had a price. Now, apparently, the final payment would come from flesh. At breakfast, Daniel sat across from her with dark circles under his eyes, trying and failing to appear composed. "I thought about what you said," he murmured, staring at his tea instead of drinking it, "about not giving up." Eleanor spread marmalade onto stale toast, her movements careful. And I still don't know what there is to be done." "There may still be something." Daniel gave a tired smile. "You always say that." "Yes," she answered quietly, "because as long as I'm breathing, I will go on saying it." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face softened. "You shouldn't have to carry all of this." "But I do," she said, "and I will." He opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand, just for a moment. It was a small gesture, but it nearly undid her. If he had shouted, if he had demanded, if he had grown selfish or cruel, perhaps what she was contemplating would have felt easier to name as madness. But Daniel was not like that. He was young and anxious and proud, yes, but he still loved her. That was what made the coming deception so painful. Eleanor was preparing to damage herself for a son who would never have asked it of her if he truly understood. That afternoon, she found June in the laundry room during the late shift. The steam hung thick over the ironing station, and the smell of detergent clung to every surface. June was sorting linens with the blunt efficiency of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting life to be fair. "You look worse today," June said without preamble. "I need the name," Eleanor replied. June paused, then studied her face carefully. "Are you certain?" "No. That's not an answer. It is the only honest one I have." June wiped her hands on her apron and lowered her voice. "There's a man called Peter Voss. He isn't the doctor. He arranges things. Private clinic outside the city. You say I sent you, but only once and only if he asks." Eleanor felt suddenly cold, though the room was stifling. "Is it legal?" June let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "Do you really think legal people speak through women folding hospital sheets on night shifts?" Eleanor said nothing. June's expression softened, just barely. "Listen to me. You can still walk away. Lots of people do. And the woman you mentioned, the one who did it years ago? She lived. That is not the same as living well." "No," June admitted, "it isn't." The address was written on the back of a receipt. Eleanor folded it into her handbag as if it might burn through the leather. For the next 2 days she did nothing. She went to work, she cleaned stairwells, she mended cuffs, she stood in queues, she smiled at neighbors. But beneath every ordinary movement was the secret knowledge of the paper in her bag. On the 3rd day, she took the bus out of town. The clinic was not in a polished district or attached to any respectable hospital. It stood behind a private road lined with bare trees and looked, at first glance, like a converted residence trying too hard to seem professional. Its curtains were too thick, its sign too discreet, its windows too dark. Eleanor nearly turned around twice before she reached the door. Inside, the waiting room was spotless in the way expensive places sometimes are, so clean they felt almost hostile. A receptionist in a cream blouse asked her name and whether she had been referred. Eleanor's mouth was dry. "June Hargreaves," she said at last. The woman gave no visible sign of surprise. She simply picked up the phone, murmured something, and asked Eleanor to sit. Several minutes later, a man in his 50s entered the room. He wore a tailored suit and had the polished calm of someone who profited best from other people's desperation. His smile was gentle enough to seem kind if one did not look too closely. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "I'm Peter Voss. Won't you come through?" His office smelled faintly of cologne and expensive paper. There were books on the shelves that seemed chosen to imply intelligence rather than actually provide it. He gestured for her to sit. "I understand Miss Hargreaves suggested you might wish to discuss a private medical arrangement." Eleanor kept her hands clasped in her lap. "I was told there may be a way to receive money in exchange for a donation?" Voss inclined his head as though discussing household repairs. "That depends on compatibility, health, discretion, and timing." "And the law?" He smiled again. "The law is a complicated creature, Mrs. Whitmore. Fortunately, what we discuss here is framed as compassionate medical facilitation between consenting adults. That is not what it is." "No," he said, "but language is often how difficult things are made survivable." Eleanor stared at him. She despised him almost immediately, not because he lied, but because he lied with elegance. He continued, "There is a client family urgently seeking a donor match. They are prepared to be generous. If you are medically suitable and the process proceeds, you would receive a significant sum." "How significant?" He named the amount. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly. It was enough. Not wealth, not freedom, but enough to close the gap that had stood between Daniel and medical school like a locked gate. She forced herself to speak steadily. "What are the risks?" Voss folded his hands. "Every surgery carries risk. Infection, bleeding, recovery complications, long-term fatigue in some cases. But people live healthy lives with one kidney." "In some cases," Eleanor repeated. "We work with experienced professionals." "You didn't answer me honestly." He gave her a level look. "Honestly, some donors recover quickly. Some do not. Age is a factor." "I am 58. "Yes. And that makes me a less desirable donor. It makes you a more carefully considered one." She nearly laughed. The man could varnish cruelty until it gleamed. "Why would anyone choose me?" "Compatibility," he said simply, "and need. Need changes many calculations." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she asked, "Would the recipient know?" "Possibly, not necessarily. These arrangements vary." "And my son?" Voss's voice turned practical. "That would be your decision. Most donors prefer privacy." Most donors, as if this were a discreet profession with traditions and etiquette. He slid a document across the desk. Preliminary forms, medical history, contact agreements, a promise of confidentiality that seemed to protect everyone except the woman being asked to sign away part of herself. "You needn't decide today," he said, but Eleanor already understood that deciding had begun the moment she entered the building. She took the forms home and hid them in the biscuit tin beneath Thomas's photograph. That evening, Daniel spoke almost animatedly for the first time in days. One of his teachers had written another letter of support. A classmate had offered to share second-hand textbooks if he managed to go. There was, beneath his restraint, a dangerous flicker of hope again. "It's ridiculous, really," he said with a strained little smile. "Everyone keeps speaking as if it's still possible." Eleanor poured more tea into his cup. "Perhaps it is." He looked at her with that same mixture of gratitude and worry. "What have you done?" "Nothing yet." "Mum!" "Nothing yet," she repeated. He leaned forward. "Promise me you are not borrowing from sharks or signing things you shouldn't." 100 truths rose in her throat. None could be spoken. "I am simply thinking," she said. Daniel sat back, unconvinced but too exhausted to push further. I wish Daniel were here." The words struck her like a blow. For a moment she had to look away. "So do I," she whispered. Later, when Daniel had gone upstairs, Eleanor took Thomas's watch from the tin and held it in her palm. It had stopped years ago, but she kept it wound out of habit, as though the small resistance of its inner spring connected her to the man who had once shared this burden with her. She imagined what he might say if he were alive. He would tell her not to do it. He would tell her Daniel would survive disappointment. He would tell her she was worth more than this bargain. But Thomas was dead, and the living had to make decisions the dead no longer bore. The medical tests were scheduled for the following week. Eleanor told Daniel she had picked up extra work in another district, which explained the missing hours and the growing fatigue. He believed her because extra work had always been the answer to every crisis in their lives. When she traveled to the clinic for blood tests, scans, and questions delivered in neutral professional tones, she carried herself with the numb obedience of someone already halfway detached from her own body. A female physician examined her with brisk efficiency. Unlike Voss, she did not varnish the danger. "You understand this surgery is harder at your age." "Yes. You may face prolonged recovery." "Yes. You could withdraw now." Eleanor looked at the woman's face, searching for judgment but found only clinical restraint. "If I withdraw," she asked quietly, "will anyone else step in and pay my son's fees?" The doctor's silence answered everything. The compatibility results came back stronger than expected. There would be no delay. When Voss called, his voice remained smooth, almost congratulatory. "Mrs. Whitmore, the arrangement can move forward within a fortnight. Funds would be transferred promptly after the procedure." A fortnight. 2 weeks until her body would be cut open for a future that was not hers. That night she sat at the kitchen table after Daniel had gone to sleep, just as she had the night his acceptance letter first arrived. Only now the rain outside the window seemed colder, and the clock in the hall no longer sounded like time passing, but like something being counted down. She signed the papers carefully, in the neat handwriting of a woman who had once believed signatures belonged on school forms, rent books, and marriage licenses, not on agreements that reduced sacrifice to transaction. When it was done, she placed the pen down and stared at her own name. Eleanor Whitmore. Widow. Mother. Cleaner. Seamstress. And now, though no one else yet knew it, a woman who had quietly agreed to carve away part of herself so that her son might walk through a door the world had tried to lock against him. The house remained silent around her. Upstairs, Daniel slept peacefully, unaware that the cost of his future had just shifted from debt and paperwork to bone-deep blood and irreversible loss. Eleanor pressed both hands flat to the table to steady herself. Then, with tears finally slipping down a face long trained not to weep, she whispered into the empty room the only truth she had left to hold. "For you, my boy," she said. "Let it be enough." Before we continue, tell us where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Some stories feel different when heard in the quiet of early morning, and some strike deepest when the night is already heavy and still. The surgery took place on a gray Thursday morning that smelled of antiseptic, wet pavement, and fear. Eleanor Whitmore had imagined, in the days leading up to it, that she might wake with a clear sense of nobility, or at least certainty. Instead, what she felt was a strange stillness, the kind that settles over a person when the mind can no longer afford panic because the body must keep moving. She rose before dawn, dressed in the plainest clothes she owned, and told Daniel she had accepted a temporary cleaning assignment in another district that would require an overnight stay. He looked up from his breakfast with concern. "Overnight? Since when do they ask that of you?" "They are preparing offices after a renovation," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even. "It pays a bit more because the work is late." Daniel frowned. "You shouldn't be doing that sort of thing now, not with your back the way it's been." Her fingers paused over the fastening of her coat. It would have been so easy in that moment to tell him everything, to sit down, take both his hands, and confess that by nightfall she would be lying in a recovery room, missing part of herself, so that he might step into the future he had earned. But she had come too far. To tell him now would either stop the act entirely or poison it with guilt. And Eleanor had made her choice. If pain must be carried, then she would carry it alone. "For you, my boy," she said. "Let it be enough." It was the last ordinary conversation they would have for a very long time. The clinic was colder than she remembered. Forms were signed again. Questions were asked again. Had she eaten? No. Did she understand the risks? Yes. Was she proceeding voluntarily? Yes. Always yes, because there was no room left in her life for any answer that might close the door she had spent decades trying to open for Daniel. A nurse helped her into a gown and tied the back with brisk efficiency. Another inserted the needle into her arm. Eleanor lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to the mechanical rhythms around her. Somewhere down the corridor, a trolley squeaked. Somewhere else, a door clicked shut. It all sounded so ordinary. That, more than anything, unsettled her. The body was about to be opened, and yet the world moved with the calm indifference of routine. Just before they wheeled her into theater, the female physician who had examined her earlier approached the bed. "You can still stop this," the doctor said quietly. Eleanor turned her head. "If I stop it, nothing changes." "Something changes. You remain intact." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "Intact is a luxury some of us lose in smaller pieces over many years." The doctor's face softened, though professionally. "You shouldn't have had to choose this." "No," Eleanor said, "but I did." They placed the mask over her face. The anesthetist told her to count backward from 10. She reached 7 before the world dissolved. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Pain first, then the metallic taste in her mouth, then the brutal heaviness in her abdomen, as if someone had filled her body with stone and left a fire smoldering inside it. She tried to move and could not. A sound escaped her throat, small, shocked, almost childish. A nurse appeared beside her. "Easy now, the procedure is over." Over. The word should have comforted her, but it did not. Nothing felt over. The wound was still there. The emptiness inside her was still there. The bargain was now real, irreversible, stitched under her skin. She remained in the clinic longer than promised because of complications with her blood pressure and a fever that frightened even the staff trained not to show concern. Peter Voss visited once, not with flowers or sympathy, but with documents. "The transfer will be completed as agreed," he said, placing the envelope on the bedside table. Eleanor could barely focus on him. "Leave it." He nodded once. "You have been admirable, Mrs. Whittemore." That nearly made her laugh, though laughter would have torn at the wound. Admirable. Such a polished word for what had really happened. When she was finally released, she could not stand straight. June helped arrange transport home through a driver who asked no questions. Eleanor arrived at her small house, pale, trembling, and weaker than she had anticipated. Every step up the path felt as though her body were being split open anew. Daniel opened the door before she could search for her key. "Mum? Good God!" His face changed instantly. He reached for her arm, alarm flooding his features. What happened? Eleanor had prepared for this. She had rehearsed it through pain, through fever, through the sleeplessness of recovery. Yet when she looked at him, the lie still tasted bitter. "There was an accident at the place I was cleaning," said weakly. "A fall. They took me in. I had some surgery." Daniel stared at her. "What surgery?" "Internal bleeding," they said. He guided her inside, every movement urgent and gentle. "Why didn't they call me?" "I told them not to. I didn't want you distracted." "That's absurd." "Yes," she murmured. "Probably." He settled her carefully in a chair and knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he examined her face, checking signs he could not yet fully interpret, but already instinctively sought. "You're burning up." "It's only the recovery." "What hospital?" Her heartbeat stumbled. "A private one used by the company." "Which company?" Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "Daniel, please, not now." He pulled back slightly, wounded by the secrecy, but more frightened than angry. "You can't just walk in half dead and tell me not now." Half dead. The phrase lodged itself in her mind. But he fetched water, then medicine, then blankets. He helped her to bed and sat up through much of the night, listening to her breathing. More than once, Eleanor woke to find him still there, elbows on knees, head bowed, staring at the floor as though trying to think his way through the fear. For the first week, he deferred everything else. He missed meetings, wrote apologetic letters, and became once again the serious, tender son she had known when he was young. He changed dressings with careful hands and asked questions she evaded with increasing skill. If he suspected the story was incomplete, he could prove nothing. The incision, after all, had been real. The weakness was real. The danger had been real. Only the reason for it had been buried. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the bedroom window, Daniel sat at the edge of the bed with the financial papers spread across his lap. Eleanor had almost forgotten that, between pain and healing, the central crisis still remained. "Mum," he said slowly, "the money for London. I've been thinking." She turned her head on the pillow. "Yes?" "I may have found a way to reduce accommodation costs if I share farther from campus, and one of my lecturers believes there could be a deferred bursary later in the year." "That's good." He looked at her, eyes shadowed by fatigue. "It still won't cover enough." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then, with great effort, she pushed herself upright and reached toward the bedside drawer. Inside was the envelope Peter Voss had delivered. She had not yet opened it in front of Daniel. She had barely touched it, as if contact alone might expose the truth. "Take it," she said. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" "Open it." He did. When he saw the amount, his face drained of color. "Mum, where did this come from?" She had prepared for this lie, too. "A private settlement," she said. "The company where I was injured did not want trouble. They paid quickly." Daniel stared at her, stunned. "For a cleaning accident?" "They were frightened I might make a formal claim." "That amount is outrageous." "Then let us be grateful for their panic." He stood and paced once across the room, the envelope clutched in his hand. This could actually do it. This could cover the first year. Books, housing, fees. God. Then he stopped. But it's your money. Eleanor looked at him carefully. It is our chance. He turned away, and when he faced her again, his eyes were wet. I can't take this from you after what you've just been through. She gave him a tired smile. You can, and you will. No. Yes. Mum, she cut him off more sharply than usual. Listen to me, Daniel. If you refuse this, then everything I endured becomes meaningless. Do you understand? He went still at those words. The room seemed to hold its breath. At last he asked, very quietly, Why do you keep doing this? Eleanor could have answered with 1,000 truths. Because she was his mother. Because she had never learned how to love by halves. Because the world had taken too much already, and she would not let it take his future too. Because some women spend their whole lives being the bridge others cross without ever looking down. Instead, she said only, Because you must go farther than I did. Daniel covered his mouth with one hand. For a moment, he looked not like a future doctor, not like a prize student, but like the little boy who had once cried beside the front door asking when his father would come home. Then he stepped forward and bent over her, his shoulders shaking. Eleanor held him as best she could, despite the pain in her side, and they remained like that for a long time. Mother and son locked together in a silence built from love, exhaustion, gratitude, and things unsaid. He left for London 2 months later. By then, Eleanor had recovered enough to stand for moderate periods, though she moved more slowly than before and tired with frightening ease. She insisted on taking him to the station. He insisted on carrying everything. They argued softly all the way there, as they always did when affection disguised itself as practicality. On the platform, the autumn wind tugged at Daniel's coat. He looked so young and so determined that Eleanor's chest tightened with pride and grief all at once. "I'll make this worth it," he said. "You already have." "No, I mean it. I'll do something with my life, something real." "You must do something honest," she corrected gently. "That matters more." He smiled. "All right, honest then." When the train announcement sounded, he embraced her so fiercely she nearly lost her breath. "I'll write every week." "You'd better." "And when I qualify," he said, stepping back just enough to see her face, "the first thing I'll do is take care of you properly. No more cleaning jobs, no more night shifts. I swear it." Eleanor smiled and nodded, though the promise pierced her in a way he could not know. He was already standing on the foundation of her ruined health, already speaking of rescuing her from burdens she had secretly embraced to lift him there. "Go on," she said, "before you miss it." He boarded. He found a seat. He leaned out the window one last time and waved like a schoolboy. Then the train pulled away, carrying him toward the life she had purchased at a cost he did not know. Eleanor stood on the platform long after the carriages vanished from sight. Around her, strangers came and went, reunions happened, departures ended, luggage rattled over concrete, announcements echoed through stale air. The world, as ever, moved on. At last she turned and made her slow way home alone. Daniel wrote often in the beginning, letters filled with lectures, anatomy labs, difficult professors, classmates from wealthy families who pretended not to notice his accent, and moments of triumph so vivid Eleanor could almost see them. Each envelope became proof that the sacrifice had not been in vain. He was doing it. He was surviving. He was climbing. Years passed. Daniel graduated near the top of his class. Then came specialist training, hospital placements, fellowships, and a growing reputation. His letters became emails, his emails became phone calls, the phone calls became brief. Still, Eleanor never complained. She told herself success had its own demands. She told herself busy men did not always forget, they were simply carried by the current of the lives they had fought hard to enter. And Daniel was entering that life more deeply with each year. He learned to dress like the men who had once ignored his existence. He learned which wines to order and which jokes to laugh at. He learned how wealth moved through private rooms and polished halls. He learned, too, that people found his story more appealing when it was softened, when the hunger, the stains, the humiliations were trimmed into something respectable and inspiring. Whenever reporters or hospital donors called him self-made, he no longer corrected them with the urgency he once might have. Eleanor noticed that first, not from what he said, but from what he stopped saying. He rarely mentioned her sacrifices now, rarely mentioned his father, rarely mentioned the town, and though he still called her Mum, warmth was slowly being replaced by distance, the kind that arrives not all at once, but in polite, almost invisible degrees. From her small house, Eleanor watched this transformation with the ache of someone who had asked life for one miracle and gotten it, only to discover that miracles, too, could come with shadows growing quietly behind them. Before we continue to the final part of this story, tell us where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Some endings arrive like thunder, but some come quietly, after years of pain, and still change everything. By the time Eleanor Whitmore turned 85, she had learned that loneliness did not always come from being alone. Sometimes it came from sitting in a beautiful room and realizing that the people nearest to you had slowly stopped seeing you at all. Daniel had done well, better than anyone in their old town had imagined. He had become exactly what his teachers once predicted: brilliant, polished, respected. He had risen through the world of private medicine until his name began appearing in magazine profiles and hospital brochures. He married a woman named Vivian Carter, the daughter of a property developer with old money, smooth manners, and a smile that never fully reached her eyes. Their wedding had taken place in the countryside under silk canopies and white roses, so expensive that Eleanor, while watching guests drift across the lawn in tailored suits and pale dresses, quietly calculated how many years of rent those flowers alone might have covered. Still, she had been proud. She had stood in a lavender dress Daniel bought for her and smiled through the ache in her side that never truly vanished after the operation. When people asked how the groom's mother felt, she answered with sincerity. "Very proud," she said every time. And she meant it, though something in Daniel's face that day had unsettled her. He was kind, attentive, generous even, but in the careful way of a man managing appearances. He checked that she was seated properly, he made sure her glass was full, he introduced her to people with a politeness that felt correct rather than intimate. "This is my mother, Eleanor," he said. Not "my mom," as he once would have. Not with warmth. Just enough. After the wedding, his visits grew rarer. Then came the matter of Eleanor's flat. The landlord sold the building to a development firm and tenants were given notice. Eleanor, by then, no longer had the strength to begin again in some distant rental market full of stairs, deposits, and forms she could barely read without glasses. She told Daniel only after she had spent 3 sleepless nights trying to solve it herself. He arrived the following weekend in a dark car that smelled of leather and expensive cologne. When she opened the door, he stared at the packed boxes in the hallway and swore under his breath. "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wanted to sort it out myself." "At 85? She lifted one shoulder. "I've sorted out worse." He ran a hand over his face. He was handsome now in the sharpened way success often made men: well-cut coat, silver watch, tired eyes that belonged to someone always expected elsewhere. "You're not staying here alone with nowhere to go," he said. "You'll come with us." Eleanor hesitated. "With you and Vivian?" "Yes." The pause that followed was small but real. Daniel heard it. "She'll manage," he said. It was not a reassuring answer, but Eleanor was too tired to fight. She moved into Daniel's townhouse in West London 3 weeks later, with 2 suitcases, a biscuit tin of old papers, Thomas's watch, and the hope, fragile and foolish though it may have been, that perhaps living together again would soften whatever distance the years had built.
The house was magnificent. Tall windows, marble floors, a staircase that curved like something from a film. Yet from the first evening, Eleanor sensed the rules of her welcome. Vivian kissed the air near her cheek and said, "We're happy to help, Eleanor, of course. We only ask that everyone respects the rhythm of the house."
The rhythm of the house, Eleanor quickly learned, meant invisibility. Breakfast was taken early and efficiently because Daniel left for the clinic by 7:30. Lunch was often elsewhere. Dinner, when there were no guests, was quiet and strained. Vivian did not insult Eleanor directly at first. She was more refined than that. Her cruelty wore perfume. It came wrapped in suggestion. "Would you mind folding the linens if you're not doing anything? Could you wipe the breakfast room? Marta is off today. It might be nice for you to keep busy. Routine is so important at your age." At first, Eleanor complied out of gratitude and habit. Work had been the language of her whole life. Folding sheets, polishing silver, arranging flowers, clearing cups, none of it was beneath her. What unsettled her was not the labor itself, but the way Vivian assigned it, not as a family member helping in a shared home, as someone whose place in the household must be justified through usefulness. Daniel noticed some of it, but not enough. Or perhaps he noticed and chose the smaller discomfort of silence over the larger discomfort of confrontation. One evening, when Vivian asked Eleanor to carry a tray upstairs, even though a housekeeper had just arrived, Daniel said lightly, "You don't need to make Mum do that." Vivian turned with a mild expression. "I'm not making her. She offered." Eleanor had not offered. Daniel glanced between them, sensed the tension, and did what he had increasingly trained himself to do in uncomfortable rooms. He smiled and let the moment pass. Months slipped by. Eleanor's world shrank to the guest room, the small rear sitting room, and the kitchen when staff were gone. Vivian began introducing her to tradesmen and delivery men in careless language. "She helps us around the house. She keeps things in order. She's terribly old-fashioned, but useful." Useful. The word settled somewhere deep inside Eleanor and remained there like grit. At night, she would lie awake remembering Daniel at 19, crying into her shoulder before leaving for London, promising that once he qualified, she would never again have to clean, lift, or scrub for anyone. She had not asked life to make him perfect, only kind. Yet kindness, she was beginning to understand, could be eroded slowly by comfort, status, and the desire never to appear out of place among the people whose approval one had chased for too long. The final wound came in winter. Daniel and Vivian were hosting a dinner party for investors, surgeons, and two couples whose names Eleanor forgot the moment she heard them. The house glowed that evening with candlelight and warm reflections from crystal and silver. Vivian wore black silk and diamonds that flashed every time she turned her head. Daniel, in a dark suit, moved through the rooms with practiced charm, his voice lower and smoother than the one Eleanor still heard in memory. Before the guests arrived, Vivian stepped into the kitchen and found Eleanor rinsing teacups. "We're short-handed tonight," she said. "Marta's son is ill. I'll need you to help with service." Eleanor straightened slowly. "Surely you can manage without me." Vivian's smile thinned. "You are living here, Eleanor." The words were soft. The meaning was not. Daniel entered just then, adjusting his cufflinks. "Everything all right?" Vivian answered before Eleanor could. "Of course, your mother is kindly helping us." Daniel hesitated, then looked at Eleanor. "Only if you feel up to it." Eleanor saw the exit in those words, small, cowardly, but there. If he had wanted to protect her, he could have done so clearly. Instead, he placed the burden back on her shoulders, where it had lived all her life. "I'm fine," she said. So she carried trays. She moved carefully among polished strangers discussing property portfolios, private schools, regulatory changes, ski holidays, and charity galas. No one really looked at her.
That, in itself, was not new. What hurt was hearing Daniel laugh from across the room in the tone he used for equals, while she passed behind them balancing stemware with hands that had once signed away part of her own body so he could stand among people like these. Near the end of the evening, one of the men, a red-faced investor already softened by wine, accepted a refill from Eleanor and then asked, almost idly, "And how long have you been with the household?"
Eleanor froze. She looked first at the man, then at Daniel. There are moments in life when time does not merely slow, it opens. It becomes wide enough for a person to see all at once what has been and what is about to be lost. In that suspended second, Eleanor saw a boy with a school satchel too worn at the corners, a young man at a train station promising to care for her, a mother sitting in a clinic bed with stitches in her side, a wedding under white roses, 1,000 choices, 1,000 silences. Daniel laughed softly, almost automatically. "Oh," he said, lifting his glass, "she's just the maid. She's been with the house forever." The room answered with easy, polite laughter. Just the maid. Eleanor did not drop the wine bottle. She did not weep. She did not accuse him before his guests. She simply stood there, feeling something inside her go very still. Vivian took the bottle from her hand with efficient grace and said to the guests, "Honestly, none of us could function without her." More laughter. Daniel did not meet Eleanor's eyes. That was the true injury, not the lie itself, but the refusal to witness what it had done. The remainder of the evening passed as if through fog. Eleanor carried plates, cleared glasses, heard her own heartbeat in her ears. When the last guest left and the front door closed behind them, the house became quiet in the way battlefields must become quiet after the final gunshot. Daniel came into the dining room while she was stacking dessert forks with trembling hands. "Mum." She did not look up. "Don't." He moved closer. "Listen to me. It was nothing, just social nonsense." Now she lifted her head. "Nothing?" At 85, after a life spent swallowing pain because rent was due, or children were watching, or grief had no practical use, Eleanor felt something rarer than anger rise in her. Clarity. "Nothing?" she said. Daniel exhaled impatiently, already defensive. "They were people from work, investors. You don't understand how these rooms function." "No," Eleanor answered. "I understand perfectly. I simply never believed you would ask me to disappear so you might shine more brightly." "That's not what happened." "It is exactly what happened." Vivian entered then, her earrings already removed, her tone sharp with exhaustion. "Must this be tonight?" Eleanor turned to her. "You have had your share of tonight." Vivian's face hardened. "Daniel, really?" He looked between them, trapped at last in the conflict he had spent years trying to avoid. "Mum," he said, lowering his voice, "you are overreacting." It was the final blow. Not because it was the cruelest thing he could have said, but because it proved how completely he had lost sight of the bridge he had crossed to become himself. Eleanor set the last fork down very carefully. "I sold my health so you could enter rooms like that," she said, "and tonight you repaid me by telling them I polish your silver." Daniel went white. Vivian frowned. What is she talking about? Eleanor looked at him. For one wild moment, she thought he might confess everything himself. The kidney, the lie, the years. Instead, he said the one thing that ended whatever remained between the son he had been and the man before her. "She's tired," he said to his wife. "She doesn't know what she's saying." Something in Eleanor's face changed then, not into rage, but into a terrible calm. Without another word, she walked to the guest room, closed the door, and sat on the bed in the half-dark. Her hands were steady now. Her breathing was steady. Grief had gone past tears and become decision.
She opened the wardrobe and took down her coat, then the suitcase from beneath the bed. She packed only what mattered: clothing, medicines, Thomas's watch, the biscuit tin, and the old medical records she had kept all these years in case memory ever needed proof. At midnight, she left the room with the suitcase rolling softly behind her. Daniel was in his study, tie loosened, drink untouched in his hand. He looked up as she passed the doorway. "Mum?"
She paused, but did not enter. "I'm leaving." His expression shifted from irritation to disbelief. "Don't be absurd, it's past midnight." "Yes," Eleanor said, "a fitting hour to depart a house where I have finally understood I was never meant to belong." He stood. "Where will you go?" She almost smiled at that. For decades, mothers were expected to know where everyone else would go, what they would eat, how they would survive. Yet when their own turn came, the questions sounded strange in the mouths of those they had carried. "Somewhere," she said, "I am not required to vanish." He took a step toward her. "You can't go over one stupid comment." Eleanor met his eyes fully then, and for the first time in many years, Daniel looked like a man standing before judgment rather than admiration. "It was never one comment," she said. "It was every silence that led to it." Outside, the winter rain had begun again, cold and thin. Eleanor opened the door herself. No servant, no son, no husband. Only an old woman with a suitcase and a truth at last, standing beside her like a companion. She stepped into the night and closed the door behind her. By morning, the house Daniel had built so carefully would still stand in polished perfection. But the woman whose sacrifices held up its hidden foundation would be gone, carrying with her not only her wounded heart, but the papers that contained the full history of what his success had truly cost. And for the first time in Eleanor Whitmore's long life, she was no longer leaving in order to save her son. She was leaving to save herself.